Tommy want wingy.
Hello and welcome to the All Good Stories podcast and the first edition of All Good Stories After Bedtime, where we believe all good stories belong to Jesus, even those we'd only watch after the kids have gone to sleep. We're your hosts, Chris Bowden
and Simon Campbell, two millennial dads who love pop culture and making connections from the content we love to the God who loves us.
And in episode 7, our premiere episode of All Good Stories After Bedtime, we're driving along as we find the good stories in Tommy Boy.
I love that we're calling this After Bedtime because I think that's absolutely what this story is. This is one that you'd turn on like after the kids are in bed. You know, you want a good old movie that you just know is going to be good to kind of close out the night. This is an After Bedtime pick for sure.
Yeah, and I'm excited that we're going to jump into movies on this podcast that aren't just G or PG rated movies. Like, we truly believe all good stories belong to Jesus. And if it really is a good story, we're going to be able to find Jesus in it. I firmly believe that ratings aren't what make it a good story. There are plenty of G-rated movies that are not good stories. And while everyone has different thresholds of like content they can consume, I say this a lot, but like Game of Thrones may not be for you, but it is for some people. And there's people who are going to watch that who love Jesus and don't love Jesus, where we can still relate with them and to them of the good stories where it's like, oh yeah, I do see Jesus on display in there. And even in a movie like Tommy Boy, we're going to have an opportunity, as we're going to attempt to do, to see Jesus in the story. And I first encountered Tommy Boy when I was in junior high, probably in 7th or 8th grade. Okay. It's like we entered the era where quotable movies became the thing, and the way that you were going to relate to friends at your school, and then probably like even now in adulthood, honestly, is being able to quote these movies together. There were certain shared experiences, moments, or even inside jokes that came from a movie, even when they came out in the 90s. I remember as we all kind of discovered this for the first time. Shut up, Richard was a quote that was thrown around at my junior high. Our poor junior high teachers had lived through that already for like 20 years, and they're still having to hear Tommy Boy quotes thrown around at school.
Well, I think there is something really connecting about throwing out those one-liners or making those references and hitting those funny moments in the class or whatever. Like, there's something about that, and this is absolutely one of those movies that's just full of those.
That's right. So, Simon, when did you first encounter Tommy Boy?
I didn't encounter Tommy Boy in junior high or anything like you did, but I came to an appreciation of it later, and it became...
like a fine wine.
Yeah. I reached appreciation later and got a chance to like really kind of take this one in, and it is one that I've quoted with my wife, and we have fun talking about moments in this. We're big SNL fans, so like being able to watch some of the SNL casts of the past in this movie is a fun thing for us.
Simon, help us dial back the clock and take us back to Tommy Boy and what it's all about if we haven't been there recently.
Yeah, so the story of Tommy Boy is centered around this character, Tommy Callahan Jr. And Tommy is a dim-witted, manically clumsy, screw-up son of Big Tom Callahan, the owner of Callahan Auto Parts in Sandusky, Ohio. This is a Midwest story to the core. Tommy Boy graduates college after attending for 7 years.
I know. They're called doctors.
And after largely squandering his college experience, Tommy arrives back home to find his dad welcomes him with open arms. He's even given a position in management despite his massive underachievement and general ineptitude. His dad then unveils a brand new brake pad division of the factory and reveals that he's engaged to Tommy's soon-to-be stepmother, Beverly. But the story turns when Big Tom dies suddenly, and the fate of the factory and everyone who works there hangs on whether or not Tommy can fill his father's shoes. So, Tommy puts his whole inheritance on the line, goes out on the road with Richard, his former schoolmate and father's right-hand man, in a desperate bid to sell 500,000 brake pads to secure the future of the company and its workers.
This movie made $32 million at the box office when it first released in the 90s and cost $20 million to make. And so this made up its production cost. You know, it didn't double its production cost, which is usually about the standard for a movie. But what's very interesting is what happened to it post its original box office release. So if we were to go on Rotten Tomatoes, you'd find that it has a 40% rating on Rotten Tomatoes.
Really?
This is not a fresh movie by the critic standards at all.
That's surprising.
It is a very, like, you could consider from a critic's perspective, like a cheap comedy, probably. But it has a 90% audience score. There is this huge disparity between the critics' reviews at 40% and the audience at 90%, which ultimately then is not surprising that this has become a cult or comedy classic for many. And it's estimated that Tommy Boy, in just 2 years after its release in the 90s, made $100 million from VHS sales, TV, syndication rights, all of the replays that this movie got in just its first 2 years after its release. And so I cannot imagine what Tommy Boy has made now if we were to dial it all the way up to 2024. But that's a really significant statistic and really is considered a comedy classic. So we think this really is a good story. We think it's a comedy classic for my family. This is very, very high in the library list of things we would just pull off the shelf at any moment and say, you want to watch Tommy Boy? Absolutely. For me, it's a little like Buffalo Wild Wings. When you mention Buffalo Wild Wings, it's like, well, now we have to go. You've said it. My brain won't let go of it.
It's a good crowd pleaser. It's hard to hate Tommy Boy.
That's right. You can't go wrong. And so as we first dive into this, let's talk a little bit about some movie magic. Just some things we love geeking out over that we think help make this a good story in general.
Yeah, so one of the things that I think is the most iconic part of this movie is the fat guy in a little coat. I think almost everyone in a few generations has at one point put on a coat that's too small for them. Fat guy in a little coat.
Yes. But agreed. And the story I love behind that, actually, I was doing a little bit of nerding out about the movie, kind of some movie trivia stuff I was just looking up. And that was actually an inside joke between David Spade and Chris Farley. Farley would do that in their shared office that they had together, just as like a bit to try and get David Spade to laugh. Yeah. And they had that recorded somewhere from like just an outtake that they didn't use. Producers saw it, went back and said, let's put that in the movie. Like, there's something to that. Let's reel that one in. And like you said, has become one of the more iconic scenes from the movie.
It's so genuine watching the interaction between those two. I've seen some stuff with Adam Sandler and specials on Chris Farley and like that relationship of that cast at that time. And there is something you can tell when the two of them are together on screen with David Spade and Chris Farley. There is something about the two of them. And Sandler always talked about how Chris Farley was just always trying to get Spade to break, to get him in those moments. And like some of the most magic moments, whether it's on SNL or in this movie, is those things that you can tell are just evidence of this relationship between the two of them.
I think that's honestly the best movie magic of the movie, really is the dynamic between the two of them, not just as characters, but as real people actors. You can see their actual friendship layered in amidst their characters. There's some, I'm sure, some parallels between who they actually were in real life and who they get to portray in this movie that just works almost seamlessly. I think all of us feel like we kind of almost know a little bit more of who Chris Farley and David Spade are as people because of watching Tommy Boy. I think some movie magic for me as an audience that's watching in 2024 now is just the sign of the times. I mean, this is fun to look back and see some of the elements that make this movie what it is that either are dated or don't exist anymore, or as I think about maybe my kids watch this some way, they're going to go, what is happening here? And some of the ones that I noted were that the grades were posted for Tommy's final on the wall at the university. It's got his name on it with his grade and everything, something that we would never have thanks to FERPA laws now. Like, never would we ever be seeing what's considered confidential information now. Was super funny to me. The other was the video camcorder footage at the wedding, kind of a fun cinematic element. They put the little bars on the screen and the recording light, and it was kind of that classic like 90s, 80s move of camcorders were the thing, right? Before we had cell phones recording everything, and we'd take it around and have people talk to the camera or catch candid moments.
Even like the pneumatic tubes in the factory of sending like memos and stuff through the factory. Like,
Ooh,
why would those exist now? You
That's
know what
a
I mean?
really good one. I like that. Or if I want to go a little darker and be like, oh, there's real people in that factory. That's cool.
No automation. Yeah.
Like, it's like this guy's like grinding a part down, right? Like something
Yeah.
a robot would definitely
Yeah.
be doing today.
Yeah.
Another one I had was that Rob Lowe's character, Paul, he tries to shoot the trucks, and what stops him is the automatic seatbelt in the car that's a part of the window. So when you shut the door, that seatbelt just like winds up the side of the
Yep.
window and pulls
Yep.
that gun into the air. And I was like, what a very niche timepiece of that particular era when that type of seatbelt existed in cars. And then again, like you said, similar to like the pneumatic tubes to send mail around, was the paper filing system. Like Michelle not using filing cabinets, or Paul being able to change them from this old Mac computer and kind of changing those records would just be a very, very different world now. So even after I watched the movie, I had moments like it didn't separate me from the movie or like take me out of it, probably because it's still close enough to my era, but went, wow, what a sign of the times here in Tommy Boy that we have changed.
Even needing to go into the gas station to ask for directions or buy a new map. Like,
yes!
why, we don't buy maps.
Gotta get
None of
yourself
us
a new
do.
map.
Yeah.
This is just not a thing. Oh, the poor Atlas companies of the world.
I think one of the other things for me was just some of the comedy around the car and the road trip. Like, it's something that's done in other comedies, but I love giving an actor like Chris Farley the opportunity to have so much physical comedy surrounding the car. Like, it's so good. It's so funny.
The car itself really feels like a character in the movie after a while. It just takes beating after beating after beating. And one of my favorites in that I was going to mention for some movie magic was really like one of the first casualties that the car has is Tommy's getting gas and Richard's inside with the Atlas, and he backs up the car to the gas pump and just like bends the door backwards because he hasn't closed the door, which I think is like a nightmare I have now. I'm at the gas station thanks to that movie that I'm going to be that guy. Yeah. But while Richard is inside getting the Atlas, you have one of my favorite comedic moments where he's talking to the guy, having this sarcastic interchange, and in the background, blurred out slightly through the window, is Tommy trying to shove that door back in place. And there's such a magic to that of like, I'm sure it would have been funny to watch Chris Farley do that up and close to the car, but to watch him do that from a distance without the sound was such a great touch that I think just added to the hilarity of the moment.
One of my favorite little movie magic touches in the movie is when you're kind of getting introduced to Callahan Auto Parts and you're seeing the legacy that Tommy Boy is inheriting. You go down the portraits of the owners and down the generations of Callahan Auto, and then you get to him and he's standing in the half doorway, kind of like a portrait there.
It almost like wanders up like out of breath.
Just looks like an idiot. Yeah. And it's so good. I love little things like that where they're putting that comedic touch without having to say anything, without even having to point it out. It's just funny.
Yeah, it's part of the beauty of the movie. There's so many throwaway comedy moments. I mean, by the time you're watching it for the third time, or even when I went back to watch it for this, I went, oh, I hadn't caught that before. Those little things are just hiding throughout. Another movie magic moment for me was really the transitions. Whoever was in charge of coordinating transitions in scenes, give them all the awards. And the ones that highlighted
What do you mean by that?
So I'll give you a few examples.
Okay.
The first one is Tommy as a kid running to school. It's establishing really like who he is. Like he runs into a door, the sprinklers turn on, he drops his textbook, he abandons his lunch because of the dog, and he misses the bus and he's chasing it. And so we're kind of getting a vibe for who he is already. But he enters the fog of the school bus. He's running behind it and then immediately exits that fog as a grown-up Tommy Boy. It's seamless in like him running in and out of that, but all of a sudden now he's grown up and he had been chasing the city bus to get to the college campus and is late for his final. And then that continues as he tries to jump through the shrubs as he's late to class and like runs into the fence that they're putting up. Yes. That theme continues through for him and it continues to establish him as a character, but there's this seamless transition in time as he runs through that exhaust of the vehicle. The other one that was really smooth for me was when his dad has passed. They're at the wedding reception. He's fallen to the ground, and the camera is looking up at the sky, and they're all looking over him. And then without missing a beat, when they pull up to stop looking down at him, the camera pulls up immediately into the funeral at the graveside. We waste no time from like wedding reception, camera goes down, and then camera pulls back up, and we are at the graveside confirming that this has actually happened. And it feels like there is no cut in that camera from the people looking down at the reception to looking up at the funeral. And I went, that is an amazing shot. That is super compelling. And it helps, I think, create that tension of like, did this really happen? Is this really happening right now? And it's like, yes, this is where we're going. This is the heartbreak of the moment. I think just adds like the pain there of just how abrupt and quick that is. That helps us relate to Tommy's real experience.
I'm really glad you mentioned those. And it's not something that you're necessarily looking for in just a silly comedy kind of thing, but those are really good examples. That's awesome.
The last movie magic one for me, I think, has to be a little bit of the soundtrack. I think there's an era in the 90s that gives us some really good soundtracks in what feel like unexpected movies. The top two that are in my mind is usually Tommy Boy and then Home Alone. And my favorite moment of that in the movie is anytime there's a montage of them like walking through or navigating through the factory, has this really strong like brass theme that kind of kicks in that makes this feel like this is a fun, meaningful, upbeat place to work in a factory. I think it embodies a little bit of Big Tom's energy and what he brings to the company in a way like as we were walking through and we go like, I want to work in this auto parts factory. Like that is a great vibe. And so that was the best example for me where I'm like, the soundtrack that's hiding in this is actually very compelling and adds a lot of elements in a way that I really enjoyed.
So you're saying they didn't have to go as hard on the soundtrack, but they did.
But they did it for us. They Phil Collins'd it for us. So that's just a little bit of movie magic of some of the things that we love in the movie Tommy Boy in general. But let's get to the heart of it. Where do we see Jesus on display? Where can we see his character, his story? Where do we see biblical themes in a movie like Tommy Boy?
And I think that there are some rich connections in this story. There are good movies and there are good stories. And I think that sometimes those aren't necessarily the same. What I would say takes Tommy Boy from being just a good movie and letting it be a good story is because I think that this story is built on an archetype of a story that is in Scripture. And we see it in Luke chapter 15. And Jesus is telling a story illustrating what the kingdom of God is like and what the character of God is like. And that's the story of the prodigal son. And I think the reason that Tommy Boy is such a good story is because we sort of see some of the dynamics of the prodigal son played out in the character of Tommy, in the character of Richard, in the character of his father, Big Tom. And so for those of you who may not be super familiar with the story of the prodigal son, Jesus is telling a story trying to illustrate what the kingdom of God is like and the type of character that God has. And Jesus tells this story about a man with two sons. There's a younger son, there's an older son, and they're very different characters. The younger son is the prodigal son, and the word prodigal means reckless, wasteful, squandering. And the other son is the older son, the responsible, the more straight-laced son. And we have these two characters in Tommy Boy and Richard. Now, Richard, in this context of Tommy Boy, is not Big Tom's son, but he has fulfilled this role of being around the father. And so Jesus goes on and tells this story about these two sons. And the younger son goes off. He squanders everything his father has given him and goes and lives in this wasteful, extravagant living. But the elder son stays around. Then later, the younger son comes back, and instead of being welcomed by disgrace and as a failure, the father welcomes the son with open arms. And in fact, one of the most remarkable things about this story is that the father runs to meet the son, to greet the son. And at that time, in that place that Jesus is telling this story, that would have been a very undignified action. The act of pulling up one's robes, because everybody's wearing robes and sandals at that point. A grown man, a dignified man, a landowning man running would have been a very undignified act. So this is a very outgoing, outward display of affection and excitement and love for the younger son coming home. And that's exactly what we see in the character of Big Tom,
That's right.
Like, how is he portrayed when Tommy comes back from college of being gone 7 years, right?
He's so excited to see him, right? Like, goes out of his way, embraces him. They've got the whole, what feels like something they do every time they see each other. They kind of like grunt and growl and do this stomp together that ends in this big hug, right? And meanwhile, like, you literally see Richard behind them, just staring and taking in, feeling like he's on the outside. Like, we get that hinted at in that moment as they share that together.
And that's not something you'd expect from, like, oh, this is the owner of this auto parts company, this is the head guy, and he's like greeting his son in this really like kind of ridiculous, childish, undignified way.
You get a bit of a hint that's like, oh, maybe this might be part of why Tommy's the way that he is, right? You get a little bit of that tension.
Yeah, they share some character there. In contrast, we have the elder son. We have the Richard character in Tommy Boy, who's been around, who's really put his nose to the grindstone, learned the family business, been around, managed his responsibilities, done everything that you would ask of a son. And we see the interaction of these two characters kind of come into conflict when Tommy comes home and is welcomed in the way that he is. In Luke chapter 15, Jesus talks about the attitude of the older son being kind of resentful. And he says, look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders, yet you never gave me so much as a young goat or never gave me a place of honor to celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered everything, comes home, you do all this stuff for him.
In the same way, what I love there is like when Tommy gets his office, Richard gets his side comment where he's like, you have a window, and why shouldn't you? You've been here 10 minutes.
That is exactly right. I was drawn to the same quote because it so exemplifies the attitude of the elder son. Oh, yeah, window. I've just been like working down in the dungeons or whatever. This is kind of the vibe, right?
Me and my fellow nerds.
Yes. So I think that this is such a strong opportunity to see something that belongs to Jesus in here. The same reason that Jesus told the parable of the prodigal son and why it would be important for the people he was trying to tell about the kingdom of God is the same reason it can be important to us and valuable for us to look at the story of Tommy Boy and say, what's in here that's good? What's in here that belongs to Jesus? And the same things that Jesus was talking about in the parable could be things that the story of Tommy Boy could use to drive home in our own lives.
That's really great. And similar yet different for me, something that I think belongs to Jesus really is the friendship we have of Tommy and Richard and what they go through over the course of the movie. We see early on that Tommy and Richard have some sort of connection at the beginning of the movie where from the very beginning, Richard comes up on his bike next to Tommy. He's like, late again. He's like, shut up, Richard. They've been friends forever, but they're very different people. Tommy's kind of always been like the popular kid, can get by on being funny and being relatable to a lot of people. And then Richard has made his way on his smart and has really had to like drive and work for his place. So they're two very different people, and yet they've remained connected to some extent. And for me, a scripture that I thought of in this was just Proverbs 18:24 says, one who has unreliable friends soon comes to ruin, but there's a friend who sticks closer than a brother. And saying, hey man, there is power and magic and meaning in friends who stick by your side and are a part of the story with you through thick and thin. And both of them have the tensions that they're navigating this movie. For Tommy Boy, we have at the Callahan employee night, I think captures it best. They say Tommy's out there, trying to sell 500,000 brake pads, and I think it's RT, the character, who says, we're all screwed. He says, that's one apple that fell way off the tree. And then on the flip side, you have Richard, where they're trying to get a sale, and one of the guys says back to him, I've been in business with Callahan forever. You're a smug, unhappy man who thinks everyone is an idiot, and it just perfectly encapsulates these two personalities. And they have been friends for a while, but on this trip, it really breaks down the walls of their relationship. And for me, I think we often find in friendships that it's proximity that then breeds vulnerability and honesty. A phrase that my wife and I often say together, kind of on the flip side, and I don't know where we heard it originally, but it's a quote we love, that's distance breeds distortion. The more that we become distant from our friends or our family or people in our lives or groups of people, it's easier for us to place assumptions on who they are, what they think, what they're doing, or how they're going to respond, which is usually when we're going to get into the most trouble. Like I start to project something because I've not been close enough to them to actually either talk to them or hear from them or be familiar enough with where they're at right now. I'm just relying on my general assumptions that I have. And so I think some of that is also true in Richard Richard and Tommy's story, they both have a bit of a distorted view of each other. Like, we just talked about Richard when Tommy gets the office, like, why shouldn't you? You've been here 10 minutes, which I think there's some truth to that. But we see the tension there. And then one of the final nails, I think, for Richard is when, I guess one of the final nails is driven into the car as well, is when the hood flies up. They get on the side of the road, and Richard says to Tommy, "You're right. You're not your dad. He could sell ketchup popsicle to a woman in white gloves," and says, "I didn't have a father, and he looked out for me. He was your dad, and you took him for granted. Oh, look, I'm Big Tom's son. He's going to bail me out so I can be a moron." It is really kind of like the climax of the tension for their relationship. Really brings to a head the tensions they're having with each other. Tommy feels like he's not being seen and heard, and Richard feels like Tommy's not seeing him or being heard in what he's trying to bring or do or what he cares about either. And then not too shortly after that, when they're in the diner and Tommy shows off some of his best salesmanship yet with
Tommy want wingy.
Richard says to him, there are book smarts and street smarts. And book smarts, which way bye-bye to you long ago, but you can read people. And when you're selling, they're buying you. And Richard recognizes the magic that Tommy brings to the table, right? This distance that they've had has been reduced. The walls of their relationship have been broken down. But really, that's only been broken down as a result of what they've been through. And what I found in relationships in my life, and really some of the best Christian relationships that I found, have been people who've been there with me to work through the crap, for like lack of a better way of saying it. People have been with me through some really great moments, but have also had to walk alongside me in moments where I've had mistakes to own, or just something has happened in my life, but it's really hard, and there's grief, and there's challenge, and there's obstacles. And I've had people to kind of lock arms with and walk with me, where we've been able to journey and figure things out together and kind of grow vulnerability and shared experience. Or I've grown in vulnerability with people where I do need to own my mistakes or own some of my assumptions. And at our best, coming to terms with that or having a conversation with somebody helps bring more clarity, honesty, and vulnerability as a result, which I think we see really clearly with Tommy and Richard in this story.
You're describing the tension between those characters so well, because really the only thing that they really have in common at the beginning of the movie is a connection to the father, right? A connection to Big Tom. And it takes a form in different ways, like Richard at that really climactic moment at the car of accusing Tommy of taking his dad for granted. And yet, Tommy shares the heart of his father in a way that's really powerful, and there's value in that. And when we see them in the diner, when we see that shift in their relationship where they begin to see the value in one another, for me, that does come back to that sort of prodigal son. Like, I sort of imagine what it would be like if that story had continued beyond when the father had gone and left the inheritance, and having those two sons be part of a family again and finding the value in one another and finding each other's unique connection to the father. We sort of see how that is coming together, and maybe to go out on a limb here to say what Jesus might be pointing to in terms of seeing value in each of those characters, in each of those sons' story, and how that might apply to us.
All right, Simon, these themes and glimpses of Jesus we are catching are great, but as we always ask, so what? What is the point? What can we walk away with from here? Some practical application for what this might actually mean for us in our everyday lives. And the first one for me is really that real friendships that you're going to create with people at some point are going to go through it all. I think some of our closest friendships are going to have to go and will go through some moments of reconciliation, forgiveness, or painful honesty. There's going to be some crucial conversations that occur along the way in these relationships, maybe whether you plan on it or not. It's almost a certain inevitability as you spend enough time with somebody. And I think there are some great scriptural references that are connected to this. I'd go to John 15, 12 through 13, where Jesus says, "My command is this, love each other as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends." I mean, really, Jesus is talking about what he's doing, but there's this same thing that's a part of our character. We're putting our friends before ourselves. There's no greater love than me caring for you as a friend and being there for you. Galatians 6:28 commands us to carry each other's burdens, and in this way you'll fulfill the law of Christ. Or 1 John 4:11 says, "Dear friends, since God loved us that much, we surely ought to love each other." There's all these references in the the Bible of like, hey, in light of God's great love for us, let's love one another in the exact same way. Let's give of ourselves for one another. And the deepest friendships I have are the ones who have been through either the ringer together. We've had moments of tension, or we've gone through moments of shared difficulty, or they've been there for when each of us have gone through something difficult, and we've been the safe people that we can share and relate with, or even just vent to. And that ability to be close and vulnerable and talk about real life is what's really won out in the long term. And I think for me, if we're walking away from this story, it's going, if we're going to build real, meaningful community with other people, which I think is something we all long for. And I think sometimes the difficulty that we face is really going to be the fire that forges a stronger relationship oftentimes when we go through these things together. But in order to gain more vulnerability and connection, we're going to have to jump into some vulnerability and courage first.
And I think there is something to learn and something to draw out in the relationship that forms between Tommy and Richard. They don't share hardly anything in common when you look at the two of them side by side. There's tons of difference, there's tons of tension, but the thing that they do share is their relationship to Big Tom, to essentially their father figure, both of them. And their love for the father and what his desires and legacy is what really binds them and puts them in a position where they can learn to appreciate and value one another. And I think that when we look at our relationships as Christians, there's a lot of differences. You can be very different from other people. You can have even a lot of tension within the family of God. But when we focus on our love for Jesus, when we find commonality in our love for him and our relationship with him and our commitment to what he wants to do in the world, that's when we can start to see the value in each other, and we can make bonds that are honoring to God and are powerful forces in the world.
Or spinning that in a different direction, these two guys are also joined together by a common mission. They're moving in the same direction toward something. They want to sell 500,000 brake pads because they both care about saving this company and the family legacy and these people's jobs. I think similarly for us as Christians, we are pursuing a similar mission. We are all headed towards making disciples, for bringing God's kingdom here and now in our world. And when we can be united on that mission, like a lot of those other differences can get out of the way. They can still be weird or difficult or hard to navigate, but we can kind of clearly see like, hey, what's most important here? Can I lay these other things aside? Or can we still link arms knowing that, hey, we're still going after the same thing? And that draws us together, even though we may differ and have tension at times.
And some of those differences may actually complement one another.
Yes.
You see that later on when they start to find their groove as they're going along selling stuff. It's like Richard throws out a number that he needs.
That's right.
And,
That's right.
You know, Tommy remembers how to say the butcher joke, you know, like.
Yeah, if left to their own devices, not good, but they are stronger together as a team, which I think is also true of us as the body of Christ.
The other thing I think the story of Tommy Boy offers us is this realization. I'm going to pull back to the prodigal son here as well, but in the family of God, we need to have space for both prodigals and older sons. We need to have room for that. I think a lot of us, if you've grown up in the church, been around for a long time, if you've done the due diligence, you've done the things, you've tried to live a good life, you've tried to follow after God, and then you see somebody who's in many ways, in many persons' eyes, may have squandered their opportunities and yet are coming into the family of God, into the church. That can be a point of tension. That can be a point of disagreement. But really, when we look at the church, there needs to be a room for both the Tommy Boys and the Richards, because there's value there, there's beauty there. And if we share the Father's heart, if we share our connection to God the Father, and if we focus on that, we can find value in each other, we can make space. And the reason why I think he tells us this parable is that we need to make room for both. The kingdom of God belongs to both.
And now, welcome to Love It or Leave It, the portion of the podcast where we get to talk about what we loved and what we could have done without in Tommy Boy along the way. Tommy Boy is one of the most quotable movies for me personally. I know for a lot of people out there. And so a question that I think we just gotta ask is, what are your top 3 one-liners in this movie? Simon, if you had to pick from all the many and varied lines that get thrown around through Tommy Boy, what makes your top 3?
Okay, I'll go in order. The first one has to be Fat guy in a little coat. Like, it's got to be that. Like, you can't, it doesn't get better than that. I think that that's something that lives forever in people's mind when they think about this movie. Number 2 is...
Brothers don't shake hands. Brothers gotta hug.
Like, when he meets Rob Lowe's character, the stepbrother.
As a family where I have 3 younger brothers, we have just beaten that one to death.
That's so good. I like thinking about that. That's really good. And then I think this one, it's down to 2, but I'll pick one here. That's going to leave a mark. I think, like, he says it multiple times. Like, that's one that comes up, but taking Chris Farley's inflection on that of being hit with 2x4, it's great.
Okay, my top 3 are probably a little more niche, and they're based off of my family's reference points that we throw around.
Oh, this is going to be my family special is what you're saying?
That's what you're getting, man, from my good old family of origin. One of my favorite characters this line comes from is the guy where they get their first sell with him, where he wants the guarantees on the box, is like one of my low-key MVP characters. And so they make all this justification of like, why you should buy from us, why should you buy from us? There's pause, and he just goes, okay, I'll buy from you. And that's all he says, and they make the sale. And that is something we say at our family gatherings when we're together all the time. We just like agree on something. It's just, okay, I'll buy from you. The second one for me is, hey, prehistoric forest. When it's after he...
No, what?
Oh, absolutely.
I don't even... Where are we talking about
So
here?
they're on the side of the road, climactic tension for the two of them, where he's beating up on Tommy, getting those free shots, hits him with the 2x4. He's like, oh, that's a good one. And he falls to the ground, and David Spade takes a deep breath, looks up, and goes... Because they're on the side of the road, and it's this dinosaur exhibit on the side of the highway. And so again, my family, it's like picking an apple in conversation, where if something like comes up out of nowhere, like somebody
a non
pulls something
sequitur
up,
kind of
yes,
comment.
We'll just kind of look and go, huh, prehistoric forest.
No,
Just kind of acknowledge, like, where are you going with this?
Wow. Oh, this is a well-trodden and well-loved movie in the Bowden house.
That line makes me giggle more than almost any of them, because like they have this big moment, and that's the tension breaker in that scene, right? Like he literally just beat his friend up and just, prehistoric forest. My last one is, again, from one of my favorite scenes at the gas pump in, like, The Door. It's when Richard comes back to the car, and he pulls on the door, and it falls to the ground. He just goes, what'd you do? And again, that is just something my brothers and I, and me, and more often than I want to admit, usually when, like, someone does something that's obviously not their fault, or something that I did wrong, I'll just go, what'd you do? Probably one of my favorite shots of any movie ever, I'd be daring enough to say, is when Tommy is walking through the cemetery after his dad's funeral, and Amazing Grace just starts playing on the bagpipes for no reason. I'm sure they threw it in because it's slightly ironic. Of course, this is what you do at funerals. But it is a picture-perfect shot. You see him walking away from the camera down this gravel road in the cemetery. It's autumn. The leaves are in the most beautiful colors. The wind is blowing through, the leaves are falling, and for me, as an Enneagram 7, have to cheat or trick myself into feeling emotions, and so this is one of those that does it for me. Like, I want to live in that moment of sadness yet beauty. I'm hearing bagpipes of Amazing Grace, a hymn that I love, and it's like the perfect fall setting that I would love to spend all of the year in, and it's just like one of those where I go, I love that shot, and I love that they included it. It serves as a great transition to this reflective moment that Tommy's going to have, where he kind of makes up what he's going to do next. And so that's just something that I love every time, that little moment in the movie I get to take in.
So what I hear you saying is that if you were an actor and you needed to be able to like get yourself in a space to produce tears, you would be going to the scene in Tommy Boy.
I don't know about tears, but sentiment for sure.
Sentiment.
If you needed me to get a little grounded or come back or just feel cozy, maybe, you know, like that one's going to do it for me.
Okay, I have a love it or leave it for you. So at the end of the movie, they go to Zelensky, which I'm surprised we have not talked about Zelensky at all.
Tangent time.
there is something unexplainable and so unique about Dan Aykroyd's accent. It is just the most
Oh my gosh, it's so
quintessential
good.
Chicago. Like, I don't imitate it well, but it's so fun. Whether it's even Blues Brothers or Christmas with the Cranks, his character in that.
It's so good.
Like,
I know there is a theory on the internet somewhere of a multiverse or cinematic universe of Dan Aykroyd with his particular character.
Okay.
In the different comedies and movies that he's in, there's this theory that there's some
It's all a
consistency
part
of
of the same
him
arc.
being interconnected across
Okay.
these movies. And I wish I knew the specifics, but I know there is some sort of, I'm sure, like deep Reddit thread that talks about the Dan Aykroyd cinematic universe.
Here's my love it or leave it. At the end, they're in Zelensky's office building in the parts place. The tension's kind of over and they're walking through by this fan, and we all of a sudden, Richard's hair flies back and reveals that there's a toupee. So love it or leave it, Richard's toupee.
Maybe leave it because it feels like an unnecessary joke, and yet it adds a little bit of something. So I think leave it. It doesn't do much for me, honestly, because all the other reference we get to it is like Tommy kind of like making a motion when he's giving his speech at the end of the movie. I don't know if it's supposed to drive some more vulnerability there somewhere, or show that like, oh, maybe this is why Richard is insecure.
I'm
but
with you.
I'm leaving
with
it.
you.
I don't think we need
I
it.
leave it because the other thing is they've been driving across the country in what is essentially a convertible. If you wanted to reveal the toupee, do it earlier.
Have it fly up with the hood of the car.
Like, it seems so. It's yes. There it is. We solved it right there.
I like that you continue in movies to just bring back a sense of realism that make you leave it. We could have walked through an incredibly fictional tale, and yet you'll find something to leave because, that's not realistic.
I just want to dig into these choices of like, why did they do this?
Why now? Why
Like,
then?
why
Yeah,
now?
that's fair.
Why was this funny?
My love it or leave it for you, Simon, is we have Paul, who I never call Paul as the character name. It's just Rob Lowe.
It's Rob Lowe.
Thank you for being on the same
But do you
page
know
with me.
that Rob Lowe is uncredited in this movie?
I was going to bring up the same thing.
Yeah?
Yeah, take it away.
Yeah, he's uncredited in this movie because he was in some Stephen King thing and had a contract that would be in conflict if he had another gig at the same
of course,
time.
as always, as a favor to the one and only SNL legend Lorne Michaels, producer of the movie, he remained uncredited to make this thing work. But my love it or leave it for you, Simon, is Rob Lowe as a bad guy, because traditionally he's known as really like a teen heartthrob character, and then even later in his career I'll pull out one of my favorite characters for him as the one and only Chris Traeger, as an
super
overly
super
positive person. And so Rob Lowe is a bad guy. Love it or leave it, Simon Campbell.
I love it. I do. His character is not complex. I don't even know how believable it is, but I do. I love it.
What I love about that in general is at every point that we get Rob Lowe's character, who most of the time is kind of like a smooth, put together like character in most things he does, he comes off as that in this movie and just fails miserably at every single attempt he has to do the thing he's intending to do. And what reminds me of like some very Home Alone slapstick scenes.
Yeah.
And it's just very reminiscent of that for me, whether he's cow tipping or just the layered effect of, he has the gun and it's the seatbelt and then hits the sign and the sign drops and breaks the chain of the dog. Like, it's this random series of events where I go, this is the most Home Alone energy, and I'm absolutely here for it. It's a love it for me as well, because his energy and attitude is great. His sarcasm and his little like biting lines just land for me every time. I'm like, you ever eat paint chips as a kid? Why? It's just like throwing those in as he goes along is so good.
I have one last one. Love it or leave it. The Davenport, Iowa shout out.
Yes, 100%.
As an Iowan, I have to say I love it.
We don't get many shout outs in movies. That's absolute love it. And I love that it's used as the premise for the whole find yourself a new map joke. I think that's so well placed. And then for it to be on top of what's already one of my favorite scenes of Tommy at the gas pump with the door, all those things combine for me to go, this is a masterpiece of a scene. It's just my favorite. Well, Simon, all good things must come to an end, including this episode.
Thanks again for joining us for episode 7. We hope you had a good time with us as we walk through this good story. And ultimately, we're hoping that this helps you grow the skill of finding the story of Jesus in the stories that you're watching.
And we would love to keep the conversation going with you because we know there's all sorts of other good stories and awesome nuances to explore. And you can track us down to talk about your thoughts, insights, or questions on Instagram at All Good Stories Podcast. We've connected with some of you already. We've loved the conversations and would love to keep it going and learning from you.
And remember, all good stories belong to Jesus.
And if you choose to give your story to Jesus, you can be sure he'll make it a good one.